In the year 1876, Missouri was a land caught between the raw frontier and the stiff civility of Reconstruction. Its prairies dotted with farmsteads, its towns held together by courthouse steps and church steeples. Yet on the outskirts of one such town stood a red brick asylum operated by the Lambert family, a dynasty of physicians whose name carried both respect and unease. What followed in whispered archives, locked away for a century, became known only later as the Macabre Asylum files of the Lambert family, classified for 100 years, as if the land itself needed time to forget. The Lamberts were not newcomers to Missouri soil. Their fortune had grown from medicine, marriage, and land, and by the 1870s, they were the region's best-known healers. Town registers show the patriarch, Dr. Horace Lambert, had studied in St. Louis before the war, returning with surgical skill and an ambition that reached beyond ordinary practice. His brothers and cousins followed him, until nearly every Lambert male bore the title of doctor. They built their asylum with local brick and state funding, presenting it as a beacon of science, yet its walls soon carried a reputation that would not wash clean. Even in those days, when asylums were multiplying across America, the Lambert institution was unusual. It did not sit in the bustle of a city, but on the wooded fringe of the county line, where the prairie dipped into ravines and the river twisted like a serpent. Farmers carting produce to market avoided the road that passed the asylum gate, muttering that screams carried farther there than the wind should allow. Nurses who worked within its walls rarely stayed long. They collected their wages, left suddenly, and refused to speak of what they had seen. And yet, no charges came. No trial, no scandal in the papers. The Lamberts were careful men. Their records, when submitted to state officials, were orderly. Columns of patient names, diagnoses written in precise Latin, treatments listed as if drawn from medical textbooks. But the townspeople spoke differently. They said the Lamberts never refused an admission, whether pauper, vagrant, or inconvenient spouse. Some were escorted through the gates by sheriffs, others by family members, clutching forged certificates. Once inside, few were seen again. In the winter of 1876, state inspectors were due to make their rounds. Reform was in the air. The newspapers and street, Louis ran stories of overcrowded asylums, cruel restraints, and medical abuses. Politicians promised investigations, and the Lambert Asylum appeared on their list. For the first time in decades, there was a chance the curtain might be pulled back, but what happened next never reached the public in full. Instead, files were gathered, sealed, and ordered withheld for 100 years. By the time they were opened in 1976, the asylum had long since crumbled, its bricks scattered, its iron gates rusting in the weeds. Why was such silence imposed? The official line, stamped on state papers, cited medical confidentiality and protection of family reputations. Yet to read even the surviving fragments today is to feel something darker. The handwriting in the Lambert ledgers grows erratic, patient notes trail into symbols, and whole pages are marked with stains whose origin remains uncertain. More disturbing still are the testimonies that slip through the stray letters of nurses, the unsent drafts of petitions from families who never saw their loved ones again. Each fragment points not to simple neglect, but to an institution that swallowed lives. The year itself, 1876, has been called the Forgotten Year in Missouri's county histories. Floods struck in spring, locusts in summer, and political quarrels in autumn. Against that backdrop, the Lambert Asylum drew little sustained attention. Farmers had their own battles, widows had their own griefs. To most of Missouri, the asylum was a sealed world. Only later, when the century-long classification ended, did historians realize that nearly 50 local names vanished from census rolls between 1875 and 1878, all linked, in one way or another, to the Lambert Gates. But in the beginning, it did not appear as tragedy. It appeared as progress. The Lamberts spoke at church socials, contributed to school boards, and hosted physicians from St. Louis who marveled at their well-ordered wards. They were photographed in formal poses, mustaches waxed, gowns spotless, children in lace collars. Nothing in those portraits suggested cruelty, and that is what makes the mystery so chilling. The ordinary surface, the calm mask, behind which entire stories were erased. To walk down the Asylum Road in 1876 was to hear two conflicting voices. One said this was a place of healing, a refuge for the disordered, an emblem of modern medicine in a state still healing from war. The other whispered of barred windows hidden behind ivy, of wagons arriving by night, of coffins carried out the back gate with no records of burial. Those voices clashed, and for a time the voice of authority prevailed. But paper can be sealed only so long. When the Macabre Asylum files were unsealed after a century, archivists described them as fragments of a broken mirror. Half the records had been destroyed, yet what survived was enough to suggest horrors deliberately buried. The Lambert name, once synonymous with medical skill, was now a shadow, its legacy tied not to healing but to silence. And even then, questions remained. What exactly had been done in those wards? What experiments justified secrecy for 100 years? And why did no one, not even the state, dare speak of it until the century mark had passed? That silence is the reason we begin here, in 1876 Missouri, with the Lamberts rising high and the asylum gates locked tight. The year became forgotten not because nothing happened, but because too much did, and too many were invested in erasing it. To understand the mystery, one must stand at the edge of those woods, watching the red brick rise against the prairie sky, listening to the faint cries that carried across the fields, and knowing that once someone passed through the Lambert gates, their story rarely returned. This was the forgotten year, and it would haunt Missouri long after the calendar turned. The Lambert name in Missouri carried the weight of medicine itself. Long before their asylum drew whispers, the family had been known as healers of the frontier, physicians who traveled muddy back roads with saddlebags full of laudanum, scalpels, and prayer books. By the 1860s, their reputation had hardened into dynasty. Every son, it seemed, bore the title of doctor, and every daughter was married into circles that kept the enterprise prosperous. They were reformers by appearance, advocates for public health. But beneath the polished exterior lay rumors that their experiments reached further than the textbooks allowed. The patriarch, Dr. Horace Lambert, embodied the dual image. He had studied medicine in St. Louis before the Civil War, serving briefly as a surgeon's assistant for Union regiments. Those who knew him recalled his remarkable calm during amputations, his precision with sutures, and his willingness to test remedies on desperate men in the camps. He believed in progress, one veteran remembered decades later, but progress often meant pain. When Horace returned to his home county after the war, he came not merely as a country doctor, but as a man with vision. He spoke of asylums as instruments of healing, not prisons, and promised Missouri a model institution. His brothers, cousins, and eventually sons joined him, until the Lamberts formed a closed circle of white-coated authority. Their asylum rose on the edge of the prairie, a sprawling red brick structure with high chimneys and barred windows. To the county board, the building was proof that science had arrived in their backwater corner of the state. To farmers, however, it was a fortress whose gates swallowed neighbors and gave back little more than silence. Children herding cattle near its walls said they heard faint moans when the wind carried just right. Mothers crossing themselves on Sunday whispered that some rooms had no doors at all. Letters preserved in the state archive confirm that other doctors admired the Lamberts while keeping their distance. A correspondence from 1872 between Dr. Horace Lambert and a physician in St. Louis survives on brittle paper. The St. Louis man praised Lambert's innovation in cases of acute mania, yet added in cautious hand, "Your notes on cranial drainage exceed my comprehension. Pray explain further in person." Another letter, never sent but found among Lambert papers, describes the locked ward as a place of observation where patients were relieved of stimuli by removal of memory cues. The phrase puzzled investigators a century later, for no medical practice of the time described such methods. Inside the asylum itself, the family hierarchy was absolute. Horace oversaw the men's ward, his brother Silas managed the women's, and younger cousins took charge of infirmary and surgery. Wives and daughters handled the domestic wings, yet even their duties blurred into treatment, administering tonics, recording patient behaviors, sitting by bedsides through long nights of restraint. It was not unusual for a Lambert child of 12 to be found copying patient charts by lamplight, absorbing the language of melancholy and mania before learning their catechism. To be born a Lambert was to inherit the asylum as both home and destiny, but it was the secrecy that cast the longest shadow. Nurses hired from outside families often spoke of entire corridors where they were not allowed to enter, keys held only by Lambert hands. One recalled in later testimony, doors with 2 locks, and when opened, nothing but shadows and silence. Another described rooms lined with copper piping, humming faintly as if carrying more than water. Whether those accounts were embellished over time is uncertain, yet the consistency of such recollections suggests that hidden wards did indeed exist. The Lamberts defended their methods with polished words. When questioned by county officials, Horace would cite the latest journals from Boston or London, sprinkling his speech with Latin phrases few could challenge. He claimed his asylum used moral treatment, kindness, routine, cleanliness to restore patients. Visitors escorted through the main hall saw neat beds, orderly dining rooms, and patients engaged in sewing or gardening. But those same visitors were never taken to the north wing, whose windows were bricked over, or the cellar whose door bore a triple lock. Within family letters that survived, there are glimpses of doubt. A cousin studying in Chicago wrote to his mother that he would not return to Missouri. "I do not care to take part in practices that may one day see the light of inquiry." Another relative, a niece, scribbled in a private diary that the asylum consumes our blood more than it heals others, hinting that the institution demanded sacrifices even from those bound by name. Such voices were rare, but they suggest that not every Lambert heart was blind to what the others were doing. By 1876, when state inspectors prepared to make their rounds, the Lambert family stood united outwardly, their asylum presented as a model of efficiency. Yet beneath that facade, correspondence shows anxiety. Pages in Horace's ledger grow hurried, margins filled with cryptic notations, circles, arrows, words half in Latin, half in symbols no clerk could decipher. The younger Lamberts urged him to prepare for scrutiny, to open certain wards, to release a handful of patients. Horace refused. "We have come too far," he wrote in one letter. "Our work must not be judged by eyes that do not understand." The red brick asylum remained locked in its routines, the family cloaked in respectability, but suspicion was already gathering like thunder. Neighbors noted the rise of fresh mounds behind the asylum chapel, graves without names. Merchants complained of unpaid bills, settled abruptly when rumors spread too widely. Preachers warned from pulpits that medicine without mercy could become cruelty. Yet the Lamberts, surrounded by walls of their own making, pressed on. To them, they were not villains but visionaries, custodians of knowledge too advanced for common minds. In time, their secrecy would condemn them. But in 1876, to speak the Lambert name was to invoke both reverence and fear. They were a family of physicians, reformers in appearance, experimenters in shadow, and the truth of their work lay sealed behind red brick, in letters marked confidential, in wards barred from sight. Those truths would remain hidden for a century, until the files were finally opened, and Missouri discovered what had been growing in its own soil all along. From the first days of the Lambert Asylum, admissions came quietly, almost invisibly, like drops of ink seeping into paper, until the stain could no longer be ignored. Farmers who quarreled with neighbors, wives who defied their husbands, drifters found muttering on the roadside, all could be brought to the gates under the pretense of illness. The records that survive show a steady stream of names in the early 1870s. Yet, what stands out most are the absences. For every patient admitted, few were ever recorded as discharged. The asylum's ledgers, when examined a century later, list entries as if scripted by a careful hand: manic melancholy, chronic delusion, domestic hysteria, But discharge columns are left blank. Sometimes a single word appears transferred, without further explanation, with no indication to which institution or when. In other cases, an entire line of names is crossed out in heavy ink, rendering them illegible. Families who inquired about their loved ones were told the same refrain. The patient remained under treatment, progress slow but promising. The truth, whatever it was, remained locked behind brick walls. Stories spread through the town like smoke from an unseen fire. A young blacksmith, spirited away after shouting at a county official, was never seen again. A widow who resisted selling her farm vanished after a nighttime visit from deputies, her property later acquired by a Lambert cousin. Neighbors spoke of wagons leaving the asylum grounds at dawn, carrying long boxes said to contain supplies, but which some swore were coffins. Yet, when asked directly, the Lamberts produced paperwork and polite words, assuring all that rumors exaggerated the facts. It was not that suspicions were absent. Inquests were raised more than once. In 1874, the county coroner called for an inquiry into the death of a farmer, admitted for temporary exhaustion, who was buried within a week without family consent. Witnesses testified that the man had been in good health before his confinement. The inquest was convened, evidence presented, and then abruptly dismissed. Official notes simply read, "Case resolved to satisfaction of parties." The files were sealed, and the coroner himself soon after appointed to a better-paid position within the county court, his silence assured. Another attempt surfaced in 1875, when 3 families petitioned the state for information on missing relatives. They traveled to Jefferson City with affidavits and testimony, demanding the release of asylum records. For a brief moment, the petition gained traction. Newspapers and Street Louis even printed a small column titled, "Questions on County Asylum." Yet, within weeks, the matter vanished from print. The petition was tabled, the families pressured to withdraw, and the officials involved claimed that confidentiality of the insane forbade disclosure. The Lamberts had wealth, and with wealth came influence. Their donations to civic projects, their alliances with county sheriffs and judges, ensured that inquiries seldom advanced far. The silence of nurses was another part of the design. Contracts signed in careful handwriting included clauses forbidding disclosure of patient information under penalty of dismissal and forfeiture of wages. A few dared to speak after leaving, describing patients shackled in basement rooms or subjected to treatments that left them vacant-eyed. But those accounts were easily discredited, labeled as bitterness from dismissed servants. Some nurses vanished as completely as the patients they tended. Whether they fled the county or were silenced by more direct means is impossible to prove, but the pattern was chilling. By 1876, entire neighborhoods had been touched by the asylum's shadow. Census records show sudden drops in population, clusters of names absent from later rolls, households reduced without explanation. Neighbors whispered but rarely confronted. To accuse the Lambert family directly was to invite ruin, for they held not only the asylum but also medical authority across the county. A farmer who dared complain might find his supply credit cut off at the general store, whose owner owed debts to the Lamberts. A preacher who hinted at abuses found his church pews suddenly empty. Congregants warned that he was sowing disorder. Power insulated the family as effectively as the red brick walls. And then there was the sealing of files. Surviving orders, stamped with county seals, showed deliberate action. At least a dozen records from the mid-1870s were officially marked withheld. The stated reason was patient privacy. But the effect was broader. Entire categories of cases were made inaccessible to outside review. What authority allowed a family-run asylum to dictate such terms? The answer lay in the Lamberts' position at the intersection of medicine and politics. They were the county's experts in health, the custodians of state funds for the care of the insane. To challenge them was to risk appearing hostile to science and progress. The truth is that Missouri in those years was still raw, its institutions fragile, its law easily bent. In such soil, the Lamberts cultivated their control. Patients without records became part of the landscape, ghostly presences, known only through rumor, their names erased as if they had never existed. Families learned not to ask too many questions, for questions led to closed doors, polite refusals, and sometimes the chilling suggestion that they, too, might benefit from rest within asylum walls. Years later, when archivists broke open the sealed packets of papers, they found them strangely incomplete. Whole pages were missing, case numbers skipped, margins blackened. What remained carried fragments, notes on restraints, doses of mercury and opium, odd notations like subject unfit for release, scrawled without context. It was clear that someone had combed through the files before sealing, stripping away evidence. What lingered was enough to suggest the scale of absence, but not the details. Thus, the patients without records became the asylum's most enduring legacy. Their absence shouted louder than any testimony. The red brick walls may have fallen, the family name may have faded, but the gap in the archives remains like an open wound. Missouri in 1876 chose silence, sealing the truth for 100 years. By the time the doors were unlocked, the voices of those lost could no longer be heard. Only paper scraps and the echo of unanswered questions survived, leaving historians to piece together shadows where lives had once been. The Lambert Asylum was not only a place of confinement for the ill, it was a household, a living organism that consumed generations. Within its red brick walls, the children of the Lambert family were raised as if the asylum itself were their inheritance, a shadowed cradle that shaped them into heirs of medicine and secrecy. Where other children learned arithmetic in schoolhouses or hymns in church pews, the Lambert offspring studied anatomy by lamplight, tracing bones on parchment while listening to the muffled cries of patients through the floorboards. Accounts from local villagers describe the uncanny sight of young Lamberts at work, a boy of 12 carrying ledgers too heavy for his frame, carefully noting patient symptoms. A girl not yet grown into her corset assisting her aunt in administering laudanum, her small hands steady with the syringe. Education was not divided from practice. It was absorbed from the beginning, a form of apprenticeship that blurred the line between family duty and medical experiment. In one surviving letter, a cousin wrote, "Our youth is spent in corridors, not gardens. We learn not games, but pulses and restraints. Father says we are fortunate, for knowledge will keep us strong. Yet I find myself dreaming of the cries." The presence of these children did not go unnoticed outside the asylum walls. Farmers returning late from market swore they saw pale figures wandering the upper galleries, lanterns flickering in their hands, long after patients had been locked away. One neighbor claimed to have seen two young girls standing at the barred windows, their faces white as chalk, watching the night road as if begging to be taken away. Others whispered that the Lambert children themselves had become indistinguishable from the inmates, silent, thin, and sleepless, drifting like phantoms between wards. Such sightings fueled endless speculation. Were these pale wanderers, the offspring of the family, raised inside their fortress of medicine, or were they patients dressed in finery to disguise their captivity? No clear answer emerges even now. Census rolls list Lambert children by name, yet many vanish from records before adulthood. Diaries of townsfolk remark upon a boy with eyes too old for his face, or a girl who never spoke though she seemed to listen keenly. Whether these children died young, were absorbed into the asylum's shadowed workforce, or were themselves subjects of hidden experiments remains a mystery. The children's schooling was peculiar even by the standards of the era. Instead of primers, they were given case notes. Instead of catechisms, they memorized symptoms of melancholia, mania, and hysteria. Visitors reported being unsettled by the sight of a boy reciting in perfect Latin the descriptions of restraint methods, while his sister corrected the dosage of tincture on the blackboard. One minister wrote in his sermon journal, "They are children without childhood, their innocence consumed by the house of their fathers. I fear they play not at dolls, but at dissections." In time, the line between kin and patient blurred further. Surviving letters from the Lambert archive hint that several children were subject to observations, when they displayed unusual traits, dream-walking, sudden tempers, or long silences. One margin note beside a child's name reads only, "Continue observation, susceptible." Did the Lamberts turn their own into patients for the sake of study? Or were these simply notes of anxious parents, convinced that illness ran in the bloodline? The files, deliberately incomplete, refused to answer. For the villagers, the children became part of the asylum's eerie aura. At dusk, when the lanterns were lit in the halls, shadows of small figures appeared on the curtains. On storm nights, voices like lullabies were said to drift across the fields, though no nurse would admit to singing. Some claimed the children never aged. Sightings of the same pale boy at the gate, year after year, with no sign of growing taller. Such tales blurred truth and folklore until the two became inseparable. The family itself insisted that the children were educated for the noble work of healing. Yet their education left no room for laughter or innocence. They lived in the asylum as if it were their nursery, their classroom, their graveyard. Neighbors noticed that few Lambert children played in the town square, joined picnics, or courted openly. Their lives remained behind walls, as if bound by some unspoken pact. When one young daughter briefly attended a church school, she was withdrawn after only 2 months. Her classmates remembered her as sweet, but lost, as if she lived in another place altogether. By 1876, when the asylum's reputation had begun to draw suspicion, the role of the children was already a matter of gossip. Were they heirs or victims? Did they perpetuate their father's legacy willingly, or were they swallowed by it? The sealed records offer no resolution. A century later, archivists found sketches in a Lambert ledger, children drawn in profile, with annotations of height, weight, temperament. Next to one, the note read, "Subject resists but adapts." Next to another, "Compliant, memory pliable." Whether these were patients misidentified as children or children studied as patients, no one could say. The image that lingers is of a household where childhood itself was erased. To be born a Lambert was to enter the asylum as naturally as entering life, to breathe its air, to carry its secrets. Pale children glimpsed at windows, their faces ghost-like in the moonlight, embodied the unease of a community that no longer knew where medicine ended and family began. Were they the next generation of healers, or the earliest casualties of a dynasty that confused bloodline with experiment? That question remains unanswered, as the walls that once hid them have long since crumbled, leaving only fragments of testimony and the echo of pale figures roaming corridors. No one else was allowed to enter. By the mid-1870s, the Lambert Asylum no longer carried the gloss of novelty. Its brick walls had weathered to a darker hue, its barred windows familiar to those who passed along the county road. Yet it was in this period that the first vanishings began to stain the Lambert name with whispers too heavy to ignore. Disputes with neighbors ended not in reconciliation but in silence. And silence in that county often meant only one thing: the asylum had taken them. The earliest case remembered in local lore was that of Samuel Bryce, a farmer whose land bordered the Lambert estate. In 1873, he quarreled with the family over a boundary fence. Bryce was said to be stubborn, a man who refused to yield even when facing wealthier adversaries. One evening, he was seen arguing outside the asylum gate. By morning, his house stood empty. His wife, frantic, told neighbors that Samuel had been taken for his nerves after signing papers she did not understand. She never saw him again. The asylum ledger lists a male patient, age 42, acute mania, admitted that week, but the discharge column is blank. Others followed. A miller who contested his debts to the Lamberts vanished while delivering grain. A widow who resisted selling her orchard disappeared after deputies escorted her to the asylum for her own safety. The pattern grew. Disputes became confinements. Confinements became erasures. Though families asked questions, the answers given were vague: patients transferred, patients unstable, patients deceased of natural causes. The bodies, however, were never produced. Rumors began to coil through the town like smoke. Some claimed that the missing were buried beneath the asylum itself, their graves hidden under new construction. In 1874, when an east wing was added, laborers whispered that earth removed from the foundations contained bones, hastily carted away before dawn. One workman later told a tavern companion that he had seen a man's boot, still laced tight, with the bones inside. Such testimony never reached a court, but it lived on in the whispers of farm kitchens and churchyards. The county cemetery records offer little clarity. A handful of graves marked simply unknown appear in those years, with burial fees paid by the Lambert family. Whether these were the vanished farmers and widows, or merely paupers consigned to state care, no one could say. Families who asked to see the graves were told the locations could not be disclosed for reasons of sanctity and order. In effect, the dead had no names. Attempts at justice flickered but failed. In 1875, a group of townsmen petitioned the county court to investigate the asylum's admissions. The case was briefly opened, witnesses prepared, but within weeks, the petitioners withdrew. Some suddenly employed in county offices, others falling into inexplicable silence. Official notes read simply, "Inquiry deemed unnecessary, asylum records in good order." The files from that attempt, now stored in the state archive, are missing entire pages. Where testimony should have been, there is only blank parchment stamped with a seal of confidentiality. The Lamberts themselves maintained composure. Dr. Horace, when questioned at a county meeting, dismissed the stories as fevered imaginations of rural folk unacquainted with medical science. He assured all that patients received the highest standard of care. He even invited select visitors into the asylum, showing them tidy wards and orderly dining halls, but never once were they taken into the lower corridors, nor shown the registers that locals whispered were altered with every season. For the townspeople, the vanishings became part of everyday dread. At night, when a farmer failed to return from market, neighbors muttered that perhaps the asylum had claimed another. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the Lambert grounds, lest they be mistaken for disordered and never return. Each fresh mound of earth near the chapel stirred suspicion, yet no one dared challenge the family directly. To accuse a Lambert was to risk one's own freedom, for they held both medical authority and political influence. By the time inspectors were due in 1876, the disappearances had already carved a shadow across the county. Yet, when officials reviewed the asylum's papers, they found no irregularities. Patients were listed, treatments logged, deaths attributed to fever, pneumonia, or exhaustion of the insane. No mention was made of the disputes that preceded confinement, nor of the families left searching. The inspectors left satisfied, and the Lamberts carried on. The mystery of those first disappearances endures because absence leaves the deepest mark. No bodies were ever exhumed, no verdict ever delivered. Only the whispers remain that the foundations of the asylum were not only brick and mortar, but bone and soil, layered with the silence of those who dared oppose the Lamberts. Officials denied wrongdoing, records vanished, and the voices of the missing were drowned beneath polite reports of order. Thus, the first vanishings became the template for all that followed. Disputes ending in confinement, confinement ending in erasure. Missouri's soil kept its secrets well, and the red brick walls stood unchallenged, rising over the county like a monument not to healing, but to silence. Among the Lambert papers unsealed after a century, one detail stood out to archivists with chilling clarity. The asylum's own architectural records did not match the structure remembered by locals. Blueprints preserved in the county courthouse showed a main hall, men's and women's wards, kitchens, chapel, and infirmary. Yet nurses who had once worked within those walls swore there was more corridors unmarked on maps, staircases that led into darkness, and a wing whose very existence was denied by the Lambert family. They called it, in whispers, the locked wing. The wing appeared to the casual eye as nothing at all. From outside, the red brick facade gave no clue, its windows bricked over, ivy crawling to hide the absence of light. Yet from within, strange things were heard. Nurses described doors with multiple locks, always barred, behind which came muffled cries, sometimes soft, like prayers, sometimes ragged, like the sound of animals in torment. When questions were asked, senior staff replied only that those rooms were reserved for observation. Observation of what? No one could say. One nurse, whose testimony survives in a private letter never meant for public eyes, wrote, "I was warned not to speak of what I heard at night, but I cannot keep silent even to myself. There are patients locked where no sunlight enters, their voices rising when the storm winds come. I have carried trays to the end of the corridor and left them at the locked door, only for the food to remain untouched come morning. Yet still, I hear breathing on the other side." The letter was never mailed, found decades later among her family's belongings, but it confirms that others knew of the hidden wing long before officials admitted its existence. Visitors never saw this part of the asylum. Horace Lambert himself escorted dignitaries through polished wards, showing tidy dining rooms and orderly workshops. But when one county official once strayed down a side hall, he was stopped abruptly by a Lambert son, who blocked the way and insisted the corridor was under renovation. The official, uneasy, did not press further. His later notes, discovered among court records, remark simply, "Odd, the map I was given does not show this passage." Those who claimed to glimpse inside spoke of barred windows looking out onto blank walls, corridors sealed with iron bolts, and rooms lined with strange apparatus. Some described copper pipes running along ceilings, humming faintly as if carrying more than water or steam. Others swore that the walls themselves seemed to sweat with damp, the smell of chemicals seeping from cracks in the plaster. It was like stepping into another world, one recalled. A place not meant for healing but for something altogether different. The cures said to be practiced there were unlike any taught in medical schools. Patients were strapped to chairs, surrounded by mirrors, forced to confront their own reflections for hours on end. Others were placed in darkness for weeks, emerging, vacant-eyed, unable to recall their names. Rumors told of experiments in memory relief, where patients were deprived of familiar objects, voices, even their own clothing, in order to erase attachments. Whether these methods were designed as treatment or something closer to control remains uncertain. Yet perhaps most disturbing are the fragments of testimony that suggest the locked wing did not hold only patients. Several villagers swore they saw children at its barred windows, faces pale and thin, watching silently as wagons rolled out at dawn. Were these the Lambert offspring, confined as subjects of their father's curiosity, or patients dressed in finery to disguise their captivity? No record clarifies. What is certain is that the line between kin and patient was blurred to the point of vanishing. The locked wing entered local folklore as a place of dread. Farmhands passing the asylum at night crossed themselves, muttering that the cries carried farther there than wind could carry sound. One tale told of a blacksmith who claimed he saw candlelight flicker in a bricked-up window, a figure's hand pressed against the glass, though no opening existed. Another spoke of servants ordered to scrub the corridor floors, only to find stains that reappeared each morning, as if the building itself bled. Architectural anomalies deepened the mystery. When the asylum's foundations were surveyed years later, investigators found walls where no blueprint marked them, doorways sealed with brick from the inside. One corridor led to a staircase descending into earth, cut off after only a few steps. The purpose of these sealed passages remains unknown, though some speculate they were escape routes later entombed to conceal what had taken place. What makes the locked wing so haunting is not merely the absence of records, but the deliberate effort to deny its existence. The Lamberts, when pressed, insisted no such wing existed. Yet too many testimonies survive, too many architectural inconsistencies remain, for it to be dismissed as rumor. It was there, hidden in plain sight, a part of the asylum devoted to experiments never meant for official eyes. Today, only fragments remain, sketches in margins, letters never sent, memories carried in families who dared whisper their suspicions. The locked wing stands as a symbol of the Lambert Asylum itself, a place bricked over with silence, yet never fully erased, its cries still echoing in the imagination of all who hear the story. The history of the Lambert Asylum is not only the story of patients and family, but also of those who came from the outside priests, summoned to hear confessions that chilled them into silence, and physicians who arrived with skepticism, only to be turned back at the gates. It is a story of men who should have spoken, but instead bowed to influence, wealth, or fear, leaving behind an echoing absence more damning than any testimony. Clergy were the first outsiders called into the asylum with regularity. In the early 1870s, records from the county parish note multiple visits by priests, summoned for last rites or spiritual counsel. At first, this seemed a mark of piety. The Lamberts were, after all, a family who attended services in town, sat in polished pews, and donated to church repairs. But accounts that surfaced later suggest something far darker. Priests were not only administering sacraments to the dying, they were hearing confessions from patients whose words left them shaken. One letter, preserved in the personal papers of a parish vicar, describes confessions of torment, of treatments described as punishments, and of sins confessed not for the soul's sake, but because the penitent believed they were being unmade by science. Yet the priests who returned from the asylum rarely spoke openly. When pressed by parishioners, they gave evasive answers, insisting only that the afflicted are in God's hands. Some seemed troubled, stumbling over sermons, withdrawing into themselves. One young curate, who later fled the county altogether, was overheard muttering, "They make priests into accomplices by silence." Whatever he had heard inside the asylum, he carried it with him until his death decades later, without ever setting it to paper. Physicians, too, attempted to pierce the Lambert veil. The asylum attracted attention from medical men in Street Louis, and even as far as Chicago, curious about its methods. Horace Lambert was known to correspond with colleagues, sprinkling his letters with hints of innovations that raised more questions than they answered. A physician named Dr. Keating traveled from Street Louis in 1874 to examine the asylum firsthand. His diary, discovered years later, notes that he was admitted only to the main ward. He recorded neat beds, patients sewing quietly, and a sense of unnatural order. "Too perfect," he wrote. "No asylum is ever so still. Either they have discovered a miracle cure or they have hidden the truth elsewhere." After that visit, Keating wrote no further on the subject. When asked by colleagues, he brushed off questions, saying only, "The Lamberts have their ways." Another doctor, an army surgeon familiar with battlefield injuries, described hearing rumors of experimental cranial therapies in the locked wing. He requested permission to observe, but was firmly denied. Shortly afterward, his medical practice in the county failed, his patients drawn away, his debts suddenly called in. Within months, he had left Missouri altogether. His departure was remembered as a warning no physician could challenge the Lambert monopoly without risking his livelihood. The silence that blanketed both priests and physicians was no accident. The Lambert family understood that influence, carefully wielded, could shape perception as surely as medicine shaped the body. They donated to church funds, ensuring that sermons praised their generosity. They contributed to medical societies, so their names appeared on reports of reform and progress. And when suspicion threatened to break through, they offered appointments, stipends, or quiet payments that soothed the restless. A coroner gained a new post, a judge received campaign funds, a priest found his parish roof repaired at no expense. In each case, the result was the same: silence. Wealth allowed them to buy cooperation, but it was fear that sealed it. Those who hinted at abuses too loudly found themselves threatened with lawsuits for slander, or more chillingly, suggestions that they themselves might be in need of rest and treatment. In a county where the asylum defined madness, to be accused by the Lamberts was to risk confinement behind their very walls. More than one outspoken critic disappeared into those halls, their voices replaced by polite notices of extended treatment. This careful combination of piety, science, and money ensured that the Lambert Asylum remained untouchable. Priests, who might have raised moral alarms, were bound by confession, compelled to silence even in the face of horror. Physicians who might have exposed medical abuse were disarmed by lack of access, and the threat of professional ruin. And officials, dependent on the Lambert fortune, preferred to look away. Thus, silence became not an accident but an institution in itself, as strong as the asylum's brick walls. It was the silence of pulpits that preached charity while ignoring cruelty, the silence of medical journals that praised progress without probing, the silence of officials who declared investigations unnecessary. Each layer of silence covered the next, until the voices of patients crying behind locked doors were muffled by an entire community's refusal to hear. When the sealed records were finally opened 100 years later, historians found fragments that confirmed what had long been suspected. Letters from priests noting unholy practices disguised as care, marginalia from doctors disturbed by procedures not recorded in any manual. Yet even these scraps spoke more of absence than of revelation. The truth had been swallowed by silence, as surely as the patients had been swallowed by the asylum. In the end, the story of doctors and priests in the Lambert case is the story of complicity through quiet. Each had glimpsed enough to know something was wrong, but none dared tear down the veil. Their silence became the asylum's greatest protection, a wall stronger than brick, a shroud thicker than iron doors, and it left the county with nothing but rumors, half-remembered confessions, and the uneasy knowledge that when power and secrecy combine, even the guardians of faith and science can be made to serve them. In the summer of 1876, a state inspector named Jonathan Hale arrived quietly in the county, tasked with reviewing the Lambert Asylum. His visit was part of a broader reform effort. Missouri officials had resolved to survey the condition of public and private institutions for the insane, ensuring funds were spent properly and abuses curtailed. On paper, Hale's duty was administrative. In truth, it became the most dangerous assignment of his short career. Hale was not an inexperienced man. At 40, he had visited penitentiaries, almshouses, and other asylums across the state. His reports, preserved in the archives, show a sharp eye and a gift for detail. He noted not only ledgers and receipts, but also the tone of voices, the smell of rooms, the way patients looked at their keepers. He had earned a reputation for honesty, too much honesty. Some thought for his words sometimes embarrassed local officials. When he stepped off the train into the county that housed the Lambert institution, he carried with him the expectation of another thorough report. What he found instead was a wall of secrecy that would soon engulf him. The official records note his arrival, but not his departure. He is listed as visiting the asylum for inspection of accounts and conditions in July of that year. No report from him survives in state files. The next document mentioning his name is dated 3 years later, when his widow petitioned for recognition of his unexplained disappearance in service. It was not until the sealed Lambert files were opened in 1976 that fragments of his journals were discovered, hidden in a bundle of papers marked "Not for Release." Thanks for watching, and there it is another with, and they're watching. Those journals are the closest we come to knowing what Hale encountered inside the Lambert walls. Written in tight, slanted script, they describe a house of contradictions. The main ward was spotless, patients quiet, orderlies polite. Yet the silence seemed too perfect, the stillness unnatural. "There is a sense," he wrote, as if rehearsed, every smile, every word, delivered like a line in a play, watched by unseen eyes. Hale noted doors he was not permitted to open, corridors that ended abruptly in brick, and windows that showed no light from within. He grew uneasy, but pressed further. One entry speaks of a room barred and locked thrice, from which issued a sound I can only describe as sobbing without breath. Another describes his discovery of an apparatus in the basement, a chair of iron, fitted with restraints and wires that run into the walls. The purpose could not be discerned. Dr. Horace dismissed it as a device for calming mania, but no such device is known to me. I confess it filled me with dread. Perhaps most damning are his notes on the asylum's files. Hale requested to see admission and discharge registers. At first he was shown neat volumes, orderly columns, but while left briefly alone in an office, he stumbled upon another drawer, locked and marked with the words, "Not for Release." Within were scattered papers, half burned, containing phrases that chilled him. Subject unfit for daylight. Experiment terminated. Memory extraction attempted failure. He copied what he could into his journal, fearing the papers might be taken back before he was ready. "These notes," he wrote, "will outlast me if I am not permitted to speak." Rout is there. The last entries grow, hurried, words pressed deep into the page. "I have been told my questions disturb the order of this place. Warned politely, but warned nonetheless. I fear I may not leave with my papers intact." His final lines, scrawled across the margin, read simply, "If I vanish, look beneath the bricks." After that, no further handwriting of his survives. What became of Inspector Hale remains unknown. Officially, he never filed his report, never returned to the capital. Some say he left the county on his own accord, silenced by bribes or threats. Others believe he was swallowed by the asylum itself, confined as a patient and erased from record. The Lamberts, when later questioned, claimed ignorance. The gentleman departed of his own business. We know not where he went. Yet his belongings, including the journal fragments, were later found inside the asylum's own files, a detail no one could explain. The silence of his fate was enforced by more than family influence. County officials quickly closed the matter, declaring there was no evidence of foul play. Newspapers carried only a single brief notice: Inspector Hale missing, believed to have traveled onward without reporting. No further coverage followed. For his widow and children, there was no body to bury, only a name left off the rolls of service. When the sealed packets were opened a century later, archivists handling Hale's surviving journal pages reported feeling unsettled, as though his words carried a warning beyond the grave. One archivist wrote in her notes, "The pages smell of smoke, as if scorched, yet they are intact. His voice is present, but it trails into silence as though interrupted mid-breath." Thus, the story of Jonathan Hale entered the legend of the Lambert Asylum. He was the outsider who came closest to piercing its secrets, who glimpsed strange apparatus and files marked for secrecy, who dared to write what he saw, and he was the man who never left. His disappearance became part of the asylum's own design, proof that those who sought to expose its hidden wings and hidden graves might themselves become names without records. In 1876, Missouri expected reform. Instead, it gained another silence, another mystery, and another life erased into the foundations of the Lambert Asylum. When the Lambert files were finally unsealed in 1976, archivists expected ledgers of admissions, neat columns of diagnoses, perhaps a few faded photographs of the asylum's brick facade. What they did not expect were the leather-bound books discovered at the bottom of a sealed trunk, their spines cracked, their pages heavy with age. These were not standard medical records. They were journals, written in a hand believed to be that of Dr. Horace Lambert himself, filled with entries that blended clinical observation with something far stranger language that veered from the scientific to the ritualistic, as though medicine alone could no longer contain what he was attempting. The books, 12 in total, were wrapped in oilcloth and marked only with the initials HL. Their first pages began conventionally enough. Descriptions of patients suffering acute mania, melancholia of the domestic sort, epileptic seizures accompanied by delirium. Treatments were listed: laudanum, restraints, hydrotherapy, but soon the tone shifted. By the second ledger, entries included experiments noted not with outcomes but with aspirations. Memory extraction, attempted subject retained silence. One line reads. Another notes, patient prepared as vessel, resistance high, must refine method. The clinical hand that had once measured fevers and pulse rates now wrote of souls, vessels, and bargains. Historians who later studied the journals observed how the language oscillated between cold medical detail and words that belonged more to a chapel or crypt. Silence therapy, one repeated phrase, is never defined, though marginal notes suggest patients were placed in lightless rooms for weeks, stripped of speech until they forgot their voices. One entry reads, subject ceased crying after 9 days, began humming low tone. marked as progress. Another adds, the silence enters them, shapes them into receptacles. Even more disturbing are the passages concerning perfect vessels. At first, it seems Lambert meant docile patients, those compliant to treatment. But as the ledgers continue, the phrase takes on ritual weight. Vessel must be emptied before filled anew, one line declares. Another speaks of purging memory to create hollowness, a process never explained, though repeated references to copper wires and headpieces suggest some form of apparatus was involved. Drawings in the margins depict crude helmets with wires extending to jars. In one sketch, a jar is labeled memory fluid, its contents shaded dark. One archivist wrote in her notes that reading the ledgers felt like witnessing a descent. Early pages are those of a doctor pushing boundaries. Later ones read as the writings of a man convinced he was conducting not just science, but sacrament. The boundary between patient and experiment blurred entirely. He referred to his charges not by name but by number. Vessel 3 failed in retention, subject expired. Vessel 7 retained silence, but no transfer occurred. Vessel 11 promising memory essence visible. The casualness of such entries chilled those who read them, for they suggested not isolated trials but a systematic practice. The ritualistic tone deepens as the ledgers progress. Passages invoke what Lambert called the collector, a figure never explained in full, but always written with capital letters. The collector requires silence. The collector feeds on memory, one passage states. Whether this was metaphor, delusion, or reference to some imagined entity, no scholar can say. Yet it is clear Lambert believed he was not working alone. His medical work had become entangled with something he perceived as larger than himself, a force to which he offered his patients as vessels. What makes these ledgers most unnerving is the sense of order they project. Each experiment is numbered, failures crossed out, notes left for refinement. There is no sense of guilt, no hesitation. Only once does Lambert's tone waver. If success comes, I must decide whether to offer kin as vessels. Blood is strongest, yet blood must endure. The entry ends there, ink smeared, as though the pen had been dropped. Days later, another note appears, brisk and cold. Kin prepared. The discovery of these books decades later forced historians to reconsider every rumor. Accounts of cries behind bricked windows, children glimpsed at night, coffins carried out at dawn, all suddenly seemed less like gossip and more like fragments of truth. The ledger had given the whispers vocabulary. Silence, therapy, memory extraction, perfect vessels, words that sounded at once medical and occult, tethering science to ritual. Today the ledgers remain locked in climate-controlled archives, consulted only under strict supervision. Even so, copies of a few passages circulate among scholars, quoted in hushed tones at conferences. They have become infamous not only for what they reveal, but for what they conceal. Many entries trail into ellipses, as though Lambert stopped mid-sentence. Others end with stains dark, irregular, never tested, left as ominous reminders of what might have been spilled upon them. The Ledger of Experiments, as it came to be known, is perhaps the most damning evidence of the Lambert Asylum's hidden purpose. It is not proof in the legal sense, no charges can be laid upon ink a century old, but it is proof in the Gothic sense, the kind that grips the imagination and refuses release. To read those pages is to feel the weight of patience erased, families silenced, children turned into numbers. It is to glimpse a man of medicine transfigured into something else, a keeper of rituals that spoke of vessels and collectors rather than cures. And it is to understand why the state sealed those files for 100 years. For within those books lay not only medical history, but a portrait of how easily science can become sacrament, how healing can twist into hunger, and how an asylum meant to cure could transform into a cathedral of silence. The ledger survives as testimony, but its subjects do not. Their voices were stilled, their memories drained, their names erased, leaving only the doctor's hand, steady and merciless, across the leather-bound page. By 1878, The whispers around the Lambert Asylum had grown too loud to ignore. Families whose loved ones had passed through the gates and never returned began to organize, binding their grief into a collective cry for justice. They were farmers, merchants, widows, and laborers, ordinary people who had lost sons, wives, or brothers to what the Lamberts called treatment, and what the town increasingly feared was something far darker. That year, petitions were drawn up, names gathered, and the case of the missing was finally carried to the county courthouse. The hearings that followed should have been the first step toward reckoning. Dozens of families testified, their statements later preserved in fragments, sometimes scribbled in margins of newspapers, sometimes passed down in letters hidden in attics. One widow recalled the night deputies arrived at her door with a Lambert physician, claiming her husband suffered from temporary mania. She insisted he was sound, only weary from long days in the field. Still, they led him away. When she visited the asylum weeks later, she was denied entry. Her husband's name vanished from census records the following year. "I want him returned," she told the court. "Alive or buried, I deserve to know." Another man testified that his sister, admitted for what the Lamberts termed domestic hysteria, had written him letters for a month, then nothing. He journeyed to the asylum, demanding proof of her care. Instead, he was shown a register marked only with her initials and the word "unfit for release." When he asked to see her grave, he was told it was not customary to disclose locations. In court, he raised a trembling hand. "Not customary," he said, "is not the same as just." The petitioners grew in number until the courtroom was filled with anxious faces, voices raised in grief. For the first time, it seemed, the veil might be pierced. Records could be summoned, wards inspected, the Lamberts forced to answer. The townspeople gathered outside the courthouse, whispering that perhaps the missing would finally be acknowledged. Yet what unfolded next was not justice, but silence, sealed in the very language of law. Presiding over the matter was Judge Alpheus Brandt, a man whose career was marked by caution and whose connections to the Lambert family were whispered, but never spoken aloud. After hearing testimony for 3 days, he issued his ruling. The asylum, he declared, fell under the category of a medical institution, and therefore its records were protected by confidentiality. Patients were entitled to privacy, even in death, and physicians were bound not to disclose details that might bring shame to families. Under this reasoning, the files could not be unsealed, the wards could not be inspected, and the Lamberts could not be compelled to testify. The ruling was delivered in the language of propriety, but its effect was devastating. Families who had come seeking answers were told that their loved ones' fates were not theirs to know. Mothers wept openly in the courtroom. Fathers shouted until deputies dragged them away. The judge merely rapped his gavel and repeated, "Medical confidentiality must be preserved." In the days that followed, outrage flickered but quickly died. Newspapers published brief accounts of the decision, noting that the matter has been resolved by the highest authority. But within weeks, even these stories were buried beneath reports of harvest yields and political elections. Those who pressed further found themselves pressured to withdraw. One merchant who continued to speak of his missing son discovered his shop boycotted, his creditors calling in debts. Another man, who accused the Lamberts outright of murder, was soon after admitted to the asylum himself, diagnosed, ironically, with persecutory delusions. The case became known locally as the trial that never was. No jury was summoned, no verdict delivered, no sentence passed. Justice had been strangled by procedure, smothered in the folds of legal language. The petitioners dispersed, their unity broken, their grief forced back into silence. Some left the county altogether, unwilling to live in the shadow of a family that could erase both bodies and truth. Others endured, carrying their questions like wounds that never closed. The Lamberts emerged from the proceedings untouched, their authority intact. They returned to their asylum with heads held high, presenting themselves as vindicated, even strengthened. In sermons and public meetings, they spoke of privacy, dignity, and the noble duty of physicians to protect their patients from public shame. Behind their words lay the comfort of wealth and influence. Their donations to church and court continued. Their names appeared on civic plaques, and the community, weary of conflict, allowed silence to settle again. Yet silence does not erase memory. In private, families told and retold their stories, passing them to children and grandchildren. They spoke of the courtroom where grief was ignored, of the judge whose gavel sealed not only files but fates, of the loved ones whose names faded from records but not from hearts. These stories survived, fragmentary but persistent, until the day the sealed files were finally opened. What historians found a century later confirmed what the families had long known. The asylum's ledgers contained no discharge notes for the missing. Pages had been removed, margins scrawled with cryptic phrases. One record bore the words, "Vessel prepared." Another, "Silence achieved." None contained proof of life, nor acknowledgement of death. The judge's declaration of confidentiality had not protected patients' dignity. It had buried the truth of their erasure. Thus, the trial that never was became the asylum's most enduring verdict. It proved that influence could turn law into shield, that grief could be dismissed as noise, and that silence, once sanctioned by authority, could last for generations. No verdict was spoken in 1878, but the absence itself became a kind of judgment against the county, against the state, and against all who chose comfort over truth. The Lambert Asylum carried on, but the families carried something too: the knowledge that justice had been within reach, and then deliberately withheld. Their voices, silenced in court, still echo in every telling of the story today. When the gavel fell in 1878 and Judge Brandt declared the Lambert records untouchable under the cloak of medical confidentiality, it was more than a ruling, it was a burial. What followed was not simply the closure of a case, but the entombment of truth itself, bound in law and sealed by state order for 100 years. From that moment forward, the Lambert Asylum no longer belonged to the realm of the present. It became a ghost, its walls still standing, its patients still confined, yet its secrets locked away in archives where no light could reach. The official order, signed in the Capitol and sent down to the county courthouse, used language as sterile as it was final. The records of the Lambert Asylum were to be classified, sealed from public view, available only to authorized officials for medical or administrative purposes. The duration of this seal was unusual, 100 years. It was a span long enough to ensure that every witness would be dead, every petitioner silenced, every generation that had demanded answers laid in the ground. Silence was not temporary, it was generational, a deliberate attempt to erase memory by outlasting it. In the years that followed, the asylum continued its work, but the whisper of scrutiny faded. No more petitions, no more hearings, no more attempts at exposure. Families who lost loved ones after 1878 knew better than to challenge the system. Their questions were met with polite refusals and the cold reminder that records were confidential. They learned to swallow grief in private, passing their doubts only in hushed stories to children who would inherit them like heirlooms of sorrow. The asylum itself began to decline as the century drew toward its end. By the 1890s, newer institutions had opened in larger cities, boasting modern facilities and publicly funded oversight. The Lambert Asylum, isolated and privately controlled, fell out of favor. State subsidies dwindled, patient numbers dropped, and even the family line began to thin. A few descendants carried on the name, but the dynasty of physicians weakened with each passing decade. By 1910, the asylum closed its doors for the last time. Its windows were shuttered, its gates locked, and the once proud red brick building left to decay at the edge of the prairie. The Lambert estate, once a symbol of wealth and authority, followed the same path. Orchards withered, fences rotted, and the gardens fell to weeds. Local boys dared each other to slip through the rusting gates, returning with tales of corridors lined with dust, of furniture draped in white sheets, of doors that rattled though no wind blew. Farmers passing by swore the cries could still be heard at night, though the building stood empty. The family itself dispersed, some to Louis, others to Chicago, a few changing their names altogether, to escape the weight of their inheritance. By mid-century, the Lamberts were no longer a dynasty, but a memory, their estate a ruin swallowed by vines and shadows. Yet the silence endured, for the records remained sealed. County clerks kept the files locked in vaults, tied with ribbons, each packet marked with the date it was to be opened, 1976. Generations passed with that year printed like a curse on folders no one dared to touch. Archivists, sworn to their duty, carried the files from one office to another as buildings changed and storage improved. Dust gathered, but the seal held. Not for release, the labels warned, and so it was not released. When the century mark approached, the anticipation was muted but real. Scholars, historians, and journalists requested access, eager to see whether the old rumors had substance. Families of the vanished, now great-grandchildren of the petitioners, wrote letters to the state, asking if at last they would learn the truth. And in the summer of 1976, the seal was finally broken. Boxes that had not been opened since the 19th century were carried into the State Archive reading room. What emerged was not a single coherent story, but fragments, ledgers, journals, scraps of testimony, and above all, the eerie leather-bound books of experiments. The discovery shocked even those who had long believed the worst. The ledgers bore no discharge records for patients whose families had begged for news. Instead, they contained cryptic notations: silence achieved, vessel prepared, memory attempted. Journal entries described apparatus no known medicine could explain. Margins contained symbols and invocations that blurred the line between science and ritual. It was not only neglect that had been concealed for a century, but something more deliberate, more methodical, more unsettling. The reopening of the files did not bring peace. For the families who still lived in the county, the revelations reopened wounds that had scarred across 4 generations. Some refused to read, unwilling to disturb the fragile quiet they had built. Others pored over the papers, desperate to find even a fragment of their ancestor's name, proof that their grief had not been madness but truth all along. "We were not liars," one descendant told a reporter. "They really did vanish inside those walls." The asylum itself did not survive the century. By the 1970s, the building was a ruin. Its walls cracked, its roof caved in. Locals called it haunted, and children dared each other to enter, carrying flashlights through corridors that smelled of mildew and rot. In 1978, the county ordered it demolished. Bricks were carted away, the foundations filled with earth, and only a weedy field remained where the asylum once stood. Yet the silence it had enforced lingered still, echoing in the stories passed from mouth to mouth, the gaps in family trees, the unease of a county that had lived in the shadow of secrecy. The sealed century stands as both a practical measure and a metaphor. Practically, it meant that no trial could occur, no testimony be heard, until all who remembered were dead. But metaphorically, it revealed how silence can be stretched like a shroud across generations, suffocating memory until it becomes folklore. When the seal was broken in 1976, the truth that emerged was not fresh but ancient, like bones unearthed from forgotten soil. And just as with bones, what remained was fragmentary enough to confirm the reality of death, but never enough to restore the loss to life. The Lambert Asylum was gone, the estate abandoned, the family scattered, yet the sealed century ensured that their shadow endured, a silence imposed by law that became darker than any rumor. What began as medical confidentiality became, in time, the longest grave ever dug, 100 years deep, wide enough to bury not just patients, but memory itself. When the seal was finally broken in 1976, the Macabre Asylum files spilled into the light like a coffin pried open after a century underground. Scholars, journalists, and descendants gathered in the State Archive reading room to witness what had been hidden for so long. What they found was not the neat ledger of a family of physicians, but a scattered body of evidence, charred fragments, erratic journals, and pages marked with stains that told their own story of concealment. For the first time, the whispers of a county were given shape, and the Lambert Asylum stepped out of rumor into history. The revelations were staggering. The missing patients whose families had once petitioned the court were confirmed, not in clear words but in the chilling absence of closure. Dozens of names appeared in the admission registers, yet the discharge columns remained blank. Instead, the margins carried cryptic notes: subject unfit for release, memory failed, silence achieved. It was as if the very language of medicine had been weaponized to disguise disappearance. For the descendants reading these entries, the experience was brutal. "All we wanted was to know where he was buried," one woman said of her great-grandfather. "Instead, we learned he was erased." The journals were worse still. Bound in leather, they carried the handwriting of Dr. Horace Lambert and his kin, a script that shifted from steady precision to feverish scrawl. Here were the infamous phrases that would echo through scholarship for decades: memory extraction, silence therapy, perfect vessels. At first, they read like medical metaphors, the exaggerations of a doctor stretching for new terms. But the longer one read, the clearer it became that the Lamberts had left behind the realm of healing. They were describing procedures that blurred science with ritual, the patient reduced to vessel, memory distilled, as if it could be poured from one mind into another. Hidden experiments emerged in fragmentary detail: drawings of copper helmets with wires trailing into jars, notes on isolation beyond the senses, where patients were stripped of sight, sound, and even the markers of time until they no longer knew themselves. Observations written in cold detachment: subject expired during procedure, resistance marked as excessive. Nowhere in the journals does the word cure appear, only progress, vessel, failure, and silence. Perhaps most damning was the evidence of complicity. These were not the actions of one deranged doctor working in secret, but of a family united. Ledgers showed that brothers, cousins, even daughters participated, signing their initials beside procedures. Family letters confirmed their knowledge, some expressing doubts, others pride. The Lambert dynasty, once praised as reformers, revealed itself as a closed circle of participants in what can only be called sanctioned erasure. They had not simply hidden their patients, they had hidden themselves inside a fortress of wealth, law, and silence. For modern scholars, the files were both treasure and curse. They confirmed what had been suspected for generations, yet they offered no closure. The majority of records were gone, burned or deliberately removed. What remained was fragmentary, a broken mirror reflecting only shards of truth. Historians compared notes, piecing together timelines, but the picture never resolved. The most important question, what precisely happened to the missing, remained unanswered. No graves were located, no bodies exhumed, only rumors of foundations built upon bones and fields, where the soil was richer than it should have been. And so, the story of the Lambert Asylum became not only a tale of cruelty, but also of civic failure. Silence, enforced by law for 100 years, had become a disease of its own. Judges, priests, physicians, and officials all contributed to the burial, whether through bribes, fear, or piety. Their silence allowed the family to continue unchecked, allowed disappearances to become routine, allowed experiments to flourish in locked wings. When the files were finally opened, the damage had already been done. Justice cannot be summoned from bones a century gone. Writers reflecting on the case described it as a parable of institutions left without oversight. One editorial in 1977 put it starkly: when wealth, medicine, and secrecy combine, the asylum ceases to be a place of care and becomes a crypt. We sealed the files to protect reputation, but in so doing, we sealed our own complicity. Others called for memorials, insisting that the victims deserved more than a paragraph in state reports. The debate still lingers whether the Lamberts were misguided physicians, ritualistic experimenters, or something darker that defied definition. What remains certain is that the patients who vanished deserve remembrance. Their names, though scattered and incomplete, survive in fragments of case notes, in margins where clerks scribbled quickly before pages were destroyed. Among them, Samuel Bryce, the farmer who quarreled over a fence; Margaret Klein, the widow who resisted selling her orchard; Thomas and Eliza Hanlon, siblings admitted together; never released. Mary Ann Fletcher, marked only as vessel prepared. These names and others, once silenced, now stand as testimony. The Lambert Asylum is gone, its bricks scattered, its estate overtaken by weeds. But the Macabre Asylum files, once hidden for a century, ensure it cannot be forgotten. They remind us that silence is not neutrality, it is complicity. They warn that unchecked institutions can transform healing into horror, respectability into erasure, and they demand that the missing be remembered, not as patients without discharge, not as vessels or failures, but as lives unjustly consumed by walls meant to protect them. In the end, the story closes, not with the family who built the asylum, nor with the officials who sealed it, but with the names of those who disappeared. Spoken aloud, they are fragments stitched back into history. In their remembrance, the silence that lasted a century is finally broken.